What's down into the atmosphere enough that it's in final orbit? How much sides could it potentially go off the projected course? Well, the funny thing is, the atmosphere at any point can move it around a little bit. Right, so it does have a projected course. We're not exactly sure until it gets to its final orbit, but solar winds aren't really going to cause any movement to it at that point. It will be just the atmosphere interacting with the rocket, mainly. So if the atmosphere is pushing it left or right, it's not going to push it that much, and it won't push it. The winds, they have to be super high in order for it to move it too much. But if it has its trajectory, it'll stay pretty much on that trajectory unless it gets pushed heavily by something. But more than likely, it's not going to be pushed. But I have to take me 1 second. Let me get the latest information from NORAD. Make sure that we are at the right time. We are still at 2:04 UTC. As far as I know, plus or minus 60 minutes. Will I be able to see it from Texas as it re-enters the atmosphere? It depends on how close it is, to be honest with you. Freedom flights, if it does end up near the west coast of the U.S. and you're looking out over the ocean, maybe, but probably not. As it re-enters, it'll be pretty far away at that point, thousands of miles. So I know how big Texas is. I'm trying to move out there. I know how big it is. I know if you want to go from the top to the bottom, it's like 20 hours. Or from side to side, it's so far. So you probably won't be able to see it as it re-enters. You will be able to see it, though, with your naked eye as it passes overhead. As it orbits, you should be able to see it. So right now, it's at 203 kilometers, and once it hits 100 kilometers, the height, the altitude at 100 kilometers, that's when it starts passing through the Kármán line, which is the line between space and Earth, between the atmosphere and space. Matt, thank you so much for the super chat. Matt, super chat. And that's when it starts getting interesting. Once it's down to about 150K, 130K, probably about 120K, then we'll have to really keep an eye on this thing. Because that's when everything's going to kick up. Everything's going to, we're going to have a lot more information really quick once it's at about 120,000 kilometers, or 120 kilometers. Our countdown is adjusted to the NORAD countdown. So our countdown is as close as you can get to the right thing, but it's plus or minus 60 minutes. So we have a good estimate right here. Thank you, Jamie, for the 2,500. Greetings from Chile, Patagonia, south of Chile. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Jamie. We're at 203, about 204 kilometers above the Earth. Right now. Once it gets to 100 kilometers, like I was saying before, this commonly represents the border between Earth's atmosphere and outer space. So once you get up above 62 miles, you're in space. A little side note, Jeff Bezos' company, Blue Origin, they have a rocket called New Shepard. And they're going to be sending people in New Shepard past the Kármán line on sort of a joyride. You're going to become an astronaut if you pass the Kármán line. Pretty interesting, pretty cool.
Here in the next couple of hours is the core stage. Basically the launch vehicle that actually carried up this part of the Chinese space station. The actual Chinese space station module that got launched is the first of at least 3 large modules that will ultimately be joined together, and then Chinese taikonauts will inhabit this space station for at least the next couple of years, is my understanding. Question, can it kill people? Very, very, very unlikely to kill anybody. It'd be kind of like getting struck by lightning, right? And this is a similar sort of situation to that, where, number one, it has to land over land. Number two, it has to land somewhere, over where there's people. And they really just have to have terrible luck. It's kind of like anything. You can get killed even by a meteor from space, which they occasionally fall. So it's very, very unlikely that anybody gets killed from this or injured or hit. Odds are this thing comes down. It makes a light show that maybe somebody's able to see or record, but very unlikely to cause any injuries. PPPPOO, thank you very much for the donation. Appreciate it. Monica Swan, thank you for the $5. She says, thank you for your service. Well, thank you for helping support the work that we do here. Definitely appreciate that. So here's a question. Is this developed highly tech world? Why are we not able to destroy it before? The answer is you don't want to shoot it down while it's in space, because when it explodes, some of those pieces actually, most of them re-enter, but some of them actually go to a higher orbit where they can pose a potential threat to astronauts, either flying on Crew Dragon or flying on Soyuz or flying in the International Space Station, or also damage other satellites. So in order to prevent the problem of space debris from actually getting worse, you really don't want to shoot them down. And there's kind of a calculation that goes into this. the military looks at it and says, well, what's the actual odds that somebody gets hurt? And the odds are so low that any one person gets hurt at all, and even lower that it ends up actually being a threat to your country. That there's just really no reason, to create a threat for astronauts in space or other satellites by shooting it down. Yvette Lawrence, thank you for the $4.99. Asks, what is the altitude at re-entry? And the answer is the altitude of re-entry. Generally, the answer is it varies. Generally, the entry interface is around, 50 miles high. But it's a little bit of a fuzzy distinction. So continuing to kind of monitor the situation, currently basically the core stage is really getting close to Turkmenistan. It will then pass over Afghanistan, Pakistan, and over the Himalayas, almost directly over the Himalayas, Nepal. So very interesting trajectory. I'm just reading an update here. Okay, nothing too crazy there. So basically, here's what we know at this point. We know that this core stage will re-enter somewhere along the red ground track, either right at it or adjacent to it. We don't know yet exactly when it's going to come down. There's an estimate of it being about 2 hours until re-entry. There's can always come down a little bit sooner or a little bit later. We don't really know exactly when it's going to come down. Everyday Fools, thank you for the $19.99 donation. Really appreciate that. He says, "Buy safe BTC, everyone." So really appreciate that donation there. Jess S, thank you for the $4.99. Says, "Sorry if this was asked already, but what are the red dots on the map?" Yeah, so the red dots on the map are basically ground observation stations. So no huge significance to what's going on, just places where people are likely to observe it. And so how will we know when this thing re-enters? At some point when there's a radar update, we will no longer see, we will no longer basically see, it on the radar anymore, and that will tell us that it has come down. More likely, if it does happen to go down over land, we might see some stuff on social media. We might see some pictures or some videos of it, a bunch of fireballs coming down, and that would be the indication that it has come down. Masha Sharoki, hopefully I said your name correctly. Thank you very much for the $5. He says, so once it re-enters, it's going to slow down a lot and fall within 5 to 20 minutes. So where it re-enters, it will be close to the area that it falls in. The answer is yes. So it's going to go through this rapid deceleration from roughly 17,000 miles an hour down to roughly 1 to 200 miles an hour over a kind of a 5 to 20 minute period. So from the moment it re-enters, those pieces will likely end up somewhere along or near the ground track. A lot of it depends on which way the local winds are blowing at different altitudes, whether it's falling through a jet stream or not. Sometimes jet streams can be 1 to 300 miles an hour, right? So if it happens to fall down through a jet stream, it can move some of the pieces, in particular the lighter pieces, a lot further than the heavier pieces. But at some point, when it comes down, it will be somewhere, it will create a strewn field, kind of an elliptical shaped ellipse on the ground, with the heaviest pieces furthest along the red line, and the lighter pieces kind of not as far along the red line. And depending on the local winds, the distribution of those pieces will really be dependent on those factors. And it makes sense. The heavier pieces are going to keep more of the speed longer and travel further downrange than the lighter pieces, which are going to kind of slow down faster and kind of fall closer to the reentry point where it starts to reenter. Zoro Roanoa, thank you very much for the donation. Says the rocket will fall in Brazil. Well, we don't know that, but who knows? We'll see what happens here. Somebody asking, are there astronauts inside? If so, how many? Fortunately, this is an uncontrolled re-entry, so there are no astronauts on board. Everyone is safe. Nobody's in any imminent harm at this point on this stage. And for those of you who are wondering, what is this thing? It is basically the core stage of a Long March 5 rocket that is basically in orbit around the Earth right now, and is gradually being pulled in by the atmosphere. With every orbit it takes, it's seeing more and more drag, and it gets lower and lower in orbit. Somebody's saying, please fall in the water. Yep, that's the hope. That's the safest possible outcome, is that all the pieces just end up in the ocean and ends up being an artificial reef. Here's a good question. Sam says, can anyone explain to me how an asteroid can be so destructive, but this 20-ton rocket will cost so little? I'm genuinely curious. Yeah, a lot has to do with the fact that that this is a much lower speed. So typically, when you have asteroids or meteorites come in, they're traveling 20,000 to 40,000 miles an hour, sometimes up to 60,000 miles an hour, whereas this current speed is at 17,000 miles an hour. The other thing is that even though this is a big object, it's around 22 tons or so, it's a very large object. So it's about 100 feet long, about 16 feet across. So it doesn't have a lot of weight in proportion to its size. So all things equal, it will slow down a lot more than a dense asteroid or meteorite that's coming in at far higher speed. And the amount of energy in any object that's moving is kind of determined by a physics equation. It's called the kinetic energy equation. And it basically, the amount of energy in it is equal to 1/2 the mass of the object times the velocity squared. So when you have these asteroids come in, it seems like, well, they're only maybe twice as fast, right? It's at 40,000 miles an hour. But the actual amount of energy is 4 times as great. So twice the amount of speed, 4 times the amount of energy. So that's why often these objects can carry a lot more energy than something of similar mass that's a rocket stage. So denser object, higher speed to begin with, and even so, most asteroids and meteorites that come in break up, slow down, and enter into dark flight, just like this rocket stage will. So it takes a really, really big object to actually come in and cause significant damage, way more than 20 tons or so. Often these objects that actually cause damage, way more than that. USRB1N, thank you very much for the donation. Says, next pass will be approximately over my home. Skies are clear. Do I have any chance to spot it without any other equipment? So the answer is yes. If it's getting close to your home, go outside, try to take a look, and you may actually see something. Especially if it does happen to re-enter, you would see a bunch of fireballs. If not, and if it's still night where you are, I don't know exactly where you are, but if it is still night where you are, and if it's near the day-night terminator, you might be able to actually see it just as a satellite, just as a bright object, it looks like a star kind of, smoothly moving through the night sky. So yeah, definitely take a look. Just kind of reading some updates here. One moment. Okay, just get an update there. Looks like another commenter will be joining us a little bit later here. So once again, Everyday Fools, thank you for the chat. It says, bye, safe BTC, everyone. So here's a question: can it hit some aircraft? There's always a chance of that. Now, as I kind of mentioned earlier, you'd hope that the local, airspace authorities would issue something called a NOTAM, or a notice to airmen, that would say, hey, look, just FYI, you're along the ground track for this thing. We don't know whether it's going to re-enter or not, but I don't know how formal that process is. Sometimes regulatory agencies are not the fastest to react to this sort of situation, so I don't know that that's being done. I would hope so. Certainly, if I were flying an airplane along this ground track, I'd probably, get off a little to the side of it and be safe. Brian Smith, thank you for the $5 chat. What is that recent footage from? Is it already burning in our atmosphere? So I'm taking a look at what the recent footage is showing. So I don't believe it has entered yet. This is footage just of it passing overhead as a satellite. So right now this object is as viewable just as any other satellite is. If it happens to be in orbit near the day-night terminator, where it's night on the ground, but it's maybe day up where it is, it can shine fairly brightly, and you can see it looking like a moving star through the sky, just kind of gliding through the sky. Ashley W., thank you for the donation. She asked, will this cause Leo Paul's grief? Thanks. I'm not sure what Leo Paul's grief is. The odds of this causing any injury on the ground is very, very low. This is more of a kind of a science and news curiosity than anything. Hopefully it doesn't cause any kind of grief. I'll have to look up what Leo Paul's grief is. That's interesting. Delaney Boos, thank you for the $5. Asks, if it re-entered near where we live, would it help us to hide in the house or evacuate? So if it did re-enter where you were, while it's burning, while you're looking up and you're seeing pieces that are fireballs, you're fairly safe at that moment. When those pieces start to kind of burn out, it's not the worst idea to go inside just as an extra precaution. If you were in a house, obviously it's safer to have something over you than nothing over you, right? But no need to evacuate, no need to panic. As I described earlier, I was kind of discussing what it would look like if it actually was going to hit you. And what you would see is you'd actually see these burning fireball pieces rising in the sky, from the ground, kind of up towards, vertical from where you are. And then you'd see them actually go out almost dead overhead. And that's what happens when you go from kind of the fiery reentry type of flight to what's called dark flight, where the pieces are just falling as metal pieces. They're no longer creating plasma or burning or anything, and they're just falling. And so if you happen to see that sort of situation where the fireball rises and goes out almost dead overhead, not the worst idea to get inside. I'd probably walk inside. I wouldn't panic or anything. And you might also kind of listen if you hear any kind of sonic booms or any thunder-like sounds. Might be an indication that the pieces could be kind of approaching you. But no need to panic, no need to worry too much. Just take reasonable precautions. No need to evacuate, anything like that. Rafael Dominguez, thank you very much for the donation. Asked what went wrong, what was supposed to happen to the module. Kudos from Brazil. Well, thank you very much. Well, basically, this is the core stage of a Long March 5B rocket that was carrying up the Chinese first module for their new space station. And it is a liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen stage. Those are the fuel and the oxidizers. It also had 4 outer boosters, which were kerosene and liquid oxygen. As this thing lifted off from China on the way to orbit, all those stages burned. It dropped off the boosters, and then the hydrogen and oxygen stage pushed the space station to orbit. It then separated, so the space station could kind of fly away on its own. And normally, what a lot of countries do is they will intentionally deorbit the space, intentionally deorbit the upper stage, or in this case, the boost stage, to bring it down safely over the ocean. And for whatever reason, either the Chinese chose not to do it, or if there was perhaps a technical issue that prevented them from doing it. And so now we have this thing that's going to kind of come down on its own. So that's the best information we have about what's occurred. Obviously, if we hear anything more to update you on that, we will. Kay Andrews, thank you for the $5 donation. Can you explain how the orbit disproves a flat Earth? Yes. So the Earth is a globe. And the way orbit works is you shoot something up, first of all, you get out of the dense atmosphere and you get out into space. And if you're traveling along an Earth that is spherical, like the Earth is, and if you get that object traveling, basically sideways enough from where it launched from, the rate at which it falls, because any object in orbit is still falling. People think that gravity is less in space. It's only, percent or so less than it is on the ground. But if you're moving fast in a sideways direction, as the Earth curves away from you, as you're moving sideways under you, and you're falling at that same rate, you're considered to be in orbit. And so every 90 minutes, this object goes around the Earth And if you're on the ground and you see this object go overhead, it may not come like directly overhead of you in 90 minutes, but it will be still overhead of you in 90 minutes. So if the Earth was flat, that simply wouldn't work. It couldn't happen. So that's one way you disprove flat Earth. The other thing is, even during a lunar eclipse where you have the Earth's shadow hitting the moon, you'll notice that shadow is actually curved. It's not a flat line or anything like it would be if the Earth was flat. So Earth is definitely spherical. Jay in Atlanta, thank you for the $10. Says, you're doing a great job giving all this information over the course of many hours today. Thank you very much. A fascinating event to track live, and look forward to seeing what happens on reentry along with you. Well, thank you very much. It's going to be interesting to see where this thing ultimately comes down, and what we learn, to see what happens. So just kind of reading through more of the chats here. Der Florianator, thank you very much for the £2 or €2. Which website do you use for tracking? So this data comes from a couple different places. There are basically these Air Force space surveillance radars. There's a number of places where you can go and try to get information about this. If you're looking for passes overhead, you can go to a website called heavens-above.com, and I know that they're a free website that allows you to track different objects. But typically what happens is the raw data comes in from the Air Force. It then goes to a number of different kind of commercial sites and groups that do, companies that do simulation to try to predict reentry. And then that information is ultimately disseminated, and that's how we end up getting to display it here. Brenda M., thank you for the $5. She says, watching from Texas, and my friend is watching from Iowa. Thank you for the live stream and answering our questions. Well, you're very welcome, Brenda, and I am actually in Texas as well. I'm in San Antonio. And I often go down to the Boca Chica launch site, where SpaceX is working on their whole Mars Starship program, which has been very exciting to see those things launch and land, and it was exciting to see the first successful landing of that the other day, where the rocket ultimately survived. Jay Risey, thank you for the $5. Asks, can you compare the Space Lab to this rocket and the potential debris disbursement? Thanks for being online. Well, thank you very much. My understanding was that the Space Lab, or the Star Lab, was actually significantly higher in mass, and I'm actually going to look that up for you as we wait here. So Space Lab. Just looking for the mass estimate on that. Let's see if it says here. Yeah, so I'll have to get back to you on that. I actually don't know the immediate mass, comparing these objects. But debris disbursement, really just depends on how massive certain parts are compared to the others. So, for instance, for this Chinese, this Chinese stage, it's likely the heaviest parts will probably be the engines. So the engines will probably make it furthest along the ground track, whereas the lighter portions of, say, the fuel tanks that break apart will likely not make it down as far. And there could be a significant difference. In physics, there's something called ballistic coefficient, and it's basically relating to the cross-sectional area, or the drag that an object makes to its mass. So objects that have a lot of mass and little drag are going to move a lot further than objects that have a lot of drag and little mass. And so depending on everything that goes on there, that's what we would kind of expect, is probably the engines to kind of go furthest and be the heaviest, and the pieces that probably stay together the best as well, because they're rocket engines, so they're designed to handle a lot of heat and without melting as much. And so I would expect the engines to go kind of furthest downrange, and then other heavier parts of the rocket, piping perhaps, objects like that, to go further than, say, the edges of the fuel tanks. Also, if there are any kind of smaller tanks, those might end up going kind of further as well. That sort of thing. Atlanta Sports, thank you for the $4.99. Says, please land in Israel for their current acts. Well, we're not going to get into politics here, but what I hope is that it lands in a place that that nobody gets hurt, nobody gets injured. So looking through more questions here. Why 2 hours? So this is This is basically an estimate based on the latest, Air Force space surveillance radar estimates. Militaries around the world have radars that look into space. They point out at the sky at all hours of the day. They send out a radar signal, and like all other forms of radar, they get a return from any objects that reflect out in space that basically tell you the position, tell you the speed, and the direction that they're moving. So you end up getting this 3D view of all the tens of thousands of objects that are out in orbit. These are very powerful radars. They try to show, based on that information, that information gets fed into companies that have their own software that do estimates for reentry. But ultimately, it's a best guess. It could reenter early, it could reenter now, it could reenter a few hours after the estimate, or it could reenter right at the estimate. But it's sort of just the best guess at where this thing could end up coming down. Grevin, thank you very much for the donation. Will it affect Sweden or Scandinavia? So I'll have to look at that for you, to look at the ground tracks to see if that is in the hazard zone. I don't, off the top of my head, remember it being in the hazard zone, but it's a possibility. I'll have to take a look at it. The short answer is, as this orbital data gets more and more refined, and as we get closer and closer to entry, we'll be able to give a better estimate of where this thing is going to land. Aunt Margot, thank you very much for the donation as well. That's very, very helpful in keeping us doing what the work that we do to keep this place going. Really appreciate it. Just to kind of summarize right now, this core stage is currently going over the kind of the southern end of the Philippine Sea, the Celebes Sea. It's going to be passing over Australia shortly, and what you're looking at here is the rocket that's shown here is the core stage of the Long March 5B rocket that carried the Chinese space station to orbit. The red line indicates the ground track of where the object is going to be passing over. So, anywhere along that ground track, at this point, as we start getting closer and closer to the S-band reentry, could be a place where if this passes over you and you look up, keep an eye on the sky, see if you see anything. If you do start to see fireballs in the sky, usually these space debris reentries are visible for, a minute or two. They're a little bit slower than like a meteor you would see, which would be only a few seconds. So if you do see something like this, you can pull out your camera and try to get some footage of it. So as always, we're kind of just going through the chat and looking at answering questions as we see them come up. Obviously, if you have a question you want to have answered right away, feel free to leave a super chat. Help support us, and we tend to get to those sooner. So really, really appreciate it. So just a couple people as you go through here, you see them saying they're scared. Well, no reason to be scared. The odds of any human being injured by this are estimated at less than 1%. And the odds of that human happens to be you is about 8 billion times smaller. So very, very low chance, that this thing would be, cause any injuries. USRB1N, thank you for the donation. Message super chat says, people seem to be very worried about the impact. I think this would be similar to a small plane crash. You probably won't notice it a few miles away. And that's exactly right. It's you have this dramatic reentry, with fireballs that are glowing and pieces, spark-looking objects flying off the fireballs. But the reality is, once that goes into dark flight, the actual landing of pieces is just like you mentioned, a plane crash. It's pieces of metal that are falling out of the sky. It's dramatic if it happens to land near you, right? Probably a little bit scary if it lands near you, but the odds that it actually lands on land at all are very low. Only about 25% chance that happens. And then the odds that it happens to be near you are very, very low as well. But it'd be pieces of metal falling out of the sky. The smaller pieces wouldn't even go through a roof. It's only the really large pieces that would really pose any hazard. So probably like leftover pieces of the engines or things like that. But most of the time, even in a city, most of the space is yards. It's roofs, rooftops. It's things that it's very unlikely to actually hit you and cause any kind of any issue there. Kay Andrews, thank you for the chat. What are the chances of it exploding like the Tunguska Meteor over Siberia in the early 1900s? So the good news is this is nowhere near the mass of that Tunguska Meteor. So there will not be some massive blast event that will occur from a result of this. This will be an event where you look up, you see some fireballs. Eventually they go out, you go into dark flight, and then you have a few pieces landing on the ground, a few metal pieces, much like somebody opened up an airplane window and or airplane door and threw out some pieces. It's not it's not going to be an explosion on the ground type of situation. It's just going to be some pieces of metal falling out of the sky. And even so, the odds of it actually causing any kind of a problem for anybody on the ground are very low. But thank you for the chat. So continuing to scroll through here. Frank Langsfield, thank you very much for the donation. That's awesome. Says, awesome host, thank you for sharing. Well, I really appreciate that. I'm happy to help and kind of talk through this. It's an interesting scientific and engineering type event that's going on. One of these kind of man-made reentries. And quite interestingly, periodically there are kind of undetected reentries that occur. So every now and then people will be looking up at the sky and they'll look and they'll see a piece of man-made space debris reenter, and they'll see a nice show of fireballs and sparks and everything. And sometimes not all pieces are even tracked. Sometimes you get some of the smaller pieces that just reenter kind of randomly, and people will look up and see them and film them. And it's always dramatic, but it's mostly it's mostly a great fireworks show. So just a few general questions. Why do the hours change? As the orbit gets more and more refined, you'll see this clock all the way up until we know that if this thing is down, you'll see this clock change. Somebody asking, hi there, will a tsunami occur? I mean, what if the impact is in the ocean? So the good news is, this is not, as this thing reenters, it will break up, it will slow down, and there will not be a tsunami as a result of it hitting the ocean. It doesn't have enough energy, it doesn't have enough mass, and it will likely be in many separate pieces. So there will not be there's a giant tsunami maker or any tsunami maker at all. If it falls in the ocean, nobody will even notice. Thank you. Yeah, rocket science is always interesting. It's kind of at the extreme of what humans do. We're this species here on Earth, and we're kind of pushing the edge of technology often when we're talking about rockets. And thank you very much for the chat, Amanda Burks. Thanks for the $5. Has a question. Says, have they learned anything to prevent this from happening again? I have not been following long, so not as up to date. Thank you. Happy face. Well, appreciate it, Amanda. So the answer is, most space agencies are very careful about deorbiting their rockets, but sometimes things do go wrong. So, any launch by NASA, any launch by SpaceX or United Launch Alliance or the European Space Agency, or even the Japanese Space Agency, they will launch these rockets. And then, they'll deliver their satellite or payload to orbit. And then whatever the upper stage of that rocket is, they will often turn it, back so that the rocket ends facing the opposite direction. And they'll fire the engines enough so that you have a controlled reentry that occurs usually over the Pacific Ocean. So kind of the standard for doing things, how you do things safely and responsibly, is to always deorbit, the rocket whenever you can. For this particular Chinese rocket, that didn't happen for some reason. We still don't know whether that was intentional. They just didn't have enough fuel to do it, or whether they tried to and maybe had a technical issue that they ran into. Even among established space companies, sometimes that happens. As I mentioned kind of earlier, a couple hours ago, there was a couple weeks back, actually, there was a Falcon 9 upper stage that they tried to deorbit and for whatever reason had a technical issue. It didn't happen. And so it actually re-entered over the northwestern part of the United States. And a few pieces made it to the ground and were ultimately recovered. Nobody was injured. But the standard for how you do space safely is to deorbit whenever you can. So hopefully, lessons will be learned from this. It'd be nice to see, this doesn't happen again. Kay Andrews, thank you for the donation. How does it feel to be a vessel of scientific education for the public? It feels good. I've always been, I'm an engineer and, scientist as well. And it's always great when you can, study something over a period of many years and then try to share your knowledge with the public. I think it's great. And, if there's one thing I want people to get out of this is it's not anything to be scared of or to panic about or worry about. You're far more likely to trip and fall going to the bathroom than you are to, get injured from a piece of metal from this. But it is a curiosity. It has a little bit of that sort of lottery-like feel, like, where is this going to come down? Is it, and it makes people kind of worry more than they should. So it's just good to be able to kind of share some of this information and hopefully educate some people. So. Clean 937 Samuel, thank you very much for the donation. I appreciate it. And USRB 1N, thank you, and welcome to Cabin Crew. Appreciate it. So every now and then it looks like the tracker freezes. It actually isn't freezing. At this point, the upper stage is moving off the coast of Australia. Next up is the new area around New Zealand. So it looks like the ground track is going to pass over northern New Zealand. For anybody who's wondering, those red dots are simply observation sites where people are kind of keeping an eye out for this. But that's the meaning of the red dots there. Somebody asking, will it land peacefully? I hope so. I hope it just lands peacefully in the ocean somewhere, and it isn't a threat to anybody. And if it does land on land, hopefully it lands in a field somewhere, and then people can go and find the pieces and get a bunch of pictures. Maybe put some in museums. So that would be, it's definitely a good science education opportunity, I think, when this kind of thing occurs. So hopefully everything stays safe. One of the questions, what's the damage it will cause most likely if it lands on land? Well, most likely it will just make a little pit. If it's just if it's in a field somewhere, it just makes a little pit where it lands in. And, if it lands on a roof, if it's a small piece, it won't even go through the roof. If it's a big piece, it could go through the roof to some degree. Obviously, if it lands on a car or anything, it's going to damage the car. But as we were talking about earlier, as has happened with history, meteors and other events, the car often gets more valuable having been hit by a meteor or being hit by a piece of space debris. So it might be kind of a lottery situation as long as nobody gets hurt. Masha Sharoki, thank you very much for the $5. Asks, what are some similarities and differences with this rocket versus the one China messed up with last year? LOL. So, periodically China kind of has this history of dropping rocket debris. They sometimes when they launch, some of their launch sites are not on the coast. Some of them are and some of them aren't. And so sometimes they'll drop, rocket has different stages. So it'll lift off, it's a stack of stages. There's a first stage and often a second stage in rockets. And sometimes the first stage or even parts of the fairing will detach and sometimes land in villages or nearby in the countryside, where it's low population but not zero. And so sometimes it can land on villages or can even, in kind of the worst case scenarios has happened in history, is that sometimes you have what are called hypergolic propellants. Things like hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide. And these are basically cancer-causing chemicals, that can cause chemical burns and injuries if they do happen to come in contact with people. And sometimes these stages will have some of these hypergolic propellants and can land in areas where that are populated. And it's not a good thing. It's something that hopefully over time all countries and groups that are doing rocket launches will learn not to do. In this case, this upper stage, or this is an upper stage. It's actually the core stage that we're monitoring now. Don't believe it has any of these hypergolics. I'm not 100% sure on that, but it's definitely is good policy to not land pieces of the rocket in places that could land on people. So I hope that in the future, everybody kind of follows the same standard of, international standard of trying to safely deorbit these pieces and only dropping them over the ocean or over places where people aren't around. It's just good practice to do. A few people asking in chat, where's it going to land? We still don't know. At some point, it will land on this red line sooner or later, right? There's uncertainty over exactly when it re-enters due to differences that occur in, the density of the upper atmosphere, which changes with day and night and changes with the space weather environment, and also the fact that this rocket is actually tumbling. This core stage is rotating about 12 revolutions a minute. So sometimes it has a very broad surface into the oncoming atmosphere, wind, if you will, and sometimes it has a very narrow surface. So the amount of drag varies dramatically. So at this point, the best estimate is about 2 hours, a little over 2 hours from now for reentry. However, it could occur sooner or could occur later. We just don't know. We'll keep looking at updates. So I'll do some more questions here from the chat. Of course, as always, if you ever want to have a question answered sooner, feel free to use the super chat. It supports us, and then we're able to get to your question right away. So somebody asking, why does the timer keep changing or going up? And that's just as the orbit gets more and more refined from those space radars, we update with the latest information. If it hits the water, will it cause a level 1 tsunami? Not at all. It doesn't have enough mass, and it also will be broken up into many smaller pieces. So it will not cause a tsunami. It is not a threat if you live along a coastline of water coming up. Somebody answered, if you watched a live space video like this one's that show the Earth from space, would we possibly see the rocket flying around by any chance? So good question. You have to be in the right place. Visibility is often, if you're on the night side of the Earth and the rocket stage itself is lit up by the sun, then you might see it. It almost looks like a moving star across the sky. If you're on the ground or if you're in space, you'd see sort of a similar thing. You could see a white kind of object that's where the sunlight reflecting off this core stage. So that's what you would see like if you're in space. And re-entries have periodically been photographed. So even the last the Crew Dragon re-entry that occurred a few days ago, there was a gentleman on the International Space Station who took photos of that. Okay, so somebody asking, is it full of radiation when it lands? The answer is no. It will not be radioactive. Now, I don't know whether this Chinese, Long March 5B stage has any hypergolic propellants on it, which would be kind of a chemical irritant concern, but it will not be radioactive, so you don't have to worry about it, being a radioactive threat. It's not something like that. Somebody asking, what is the blue circle for? So the blue circle is an indication of where you would actually see it if you were on the ground. So if you were on the edge of the blue circle, it would be right at the horizon. If you were near the center of the blue circle, you would look up and the stage would be passing right over you. And if you're somewhere in the middle, it would be somewhere between, straight up from where you're at and somewhere on the horizon. And if you're outside the blue circle, you're outside the range of where you would actually see it, whether it was flying on its own or re-entering. So it's really an indication of visibility. Rose McCoy, thank you very much for the $4.99. Really appreciate that. Why are people calling this an end-of-life event? Well, it definitely isn't an end-of-life event. Odds are about 75% chance that it ends up falling in the ocean. If it does end up on land, the odds of it actually basically landing on anyone are less than 1%. And then the odds of it landing on you are about 8 billion times less than that. So it is certainly not a end-of-life event. Very, very low risk of even an injury on the ground. Very, very low chance. How much area will be destroyed if it falls on any country? really the only threat is just from pieces damaging whatever they land on. So it's like dropping metal pieces out of an airplane. Whatever they land on, it isn't really great for that thing that it lands on, but it's not going to, these aren't like bombs. These pieces don't come down and then cause a secondary explosion or, it's not like a mortar coming down or something. We're not dropping bombs or anything like that. It's just literally, metal pieces that end up surviving from this rocket. Let's see, why is the red line bent? And the answer is it really isn't bent. It just has to do with projecting the orbit of this object, which is going around a spherical object like the Earth, and the map projection, which is sort of a 2D representation of a 3D object. So it's a little bit like when you look on a map and different projections, you'll see that sometimes the lines appear to be curved. It's really just a artifact of the projection that's occurring. Some people making comments about the altitude. So the altitude right now, as the object goes between its high point of the orbit called the apoapsis and the periapsis, or the low point of the orbit. Every satellite does this, has a high point and a low point of the orbit. So every 90 minutes, roughly, this object is going around the Earth. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down in kind of a cyclical way. So that's why sometimes you see the altitude increasing and sometimes you see the altitude decreasing. It's just going up, going down. And yeah, the biggest thing that I can stress, with this whole reentry is it's not anything to be scared of, not anything to be worried about. If this does pass over you, it might be an interesting thing to go out and see. If it does happen to reentry over where you are, it would be a heck of a show. Bunch of, looks like meteors, kind of fireballs training each other in the air. But certainly nothing to be worried about. Very low odds of injury or getting hurt or anything. Jake Kaplan, thank you very much for the $5. Says, I live in LA. Judging from the map, it looks like it will re-enter over LA. Will I be able to see it re-enter? It'll be re-entering around sunset. So we don't know, we don't know that it's going to be entering in LA. Certainly not. It's there's a slight chance of that happening, but very, 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 very low. The answer is, keep monitoring our coverage here, and this red line is sort of the ground track that this is going to be following on. So, at any given moment, if this object is going to fly over you, it's worth, taking a look at it. But there's no indication that it's necessarily going to come down in LA. Okay, Andrews, thank you for the $5. Can I sue China if it lands on my car? The answer is yes. If some party causes damage to you, you can actually file a lawsuit. Now, whether they'll pay or not is a whole nother matter, but you can certainly file a lawsuit. There are treaties that I've talked about earlier between spacefaring nations, to handle this sort of situation, that if there's damage caused as a result of another nation's space activities, there are treaties to actually, have financial compensation. But that is sort of more at a more governmental level. But there's nothing to prevent you at any time from suing anybody in a civil way. If somebody causes you a loss, you can certainly file a lawsuit. Lots of questions about the specific location. The last data I saw was that it was kind of less likely to fall over the U.S. And the reason is that the passes that this is going to take over the U.S. aren't really until, kind of early in the morning, after midnight. And the current estimate is still, around 2 hours or so from reentry. So if that ends up being correct, then it will likely have re-entered before it passes over the U.S. again. But we don't, this information is by no means definitive, and it could stay in orbit a little longer, or it could fall down a little sooner. We're monitoring the situation carefully. And with every update to the radar measurements, we try to make an update on the estimated time until re-entry. Excuse me. So lots of questions here. Why is it 2 hours? And it's really just a best estimate. Looking at the radar data. There are U.S. Air Force and other assets that beam radar beams into space. They then look for the reflectivity of that, and it tells them both the location of the object, the altitude, which direction it's moving in, all those sorts of things. Marielle Salmaron, thank you very much for the donation. You asked it will come in Greece. There was actually a pass over Greece just recently. So I think the odds of it actually landing in Greece are a little bit less since it didn't re-enter there on that pass. But thank you for the donation. MLA Studios, thank you for the $1.99 donation. What's the most amount of damage that can be caused? So the heaviest parts of the rocket that could make it to the ground are likely the engines. They're heavier in mass. They're designed to withstand heat, being rocket engines, right? So if one of those were to land on something, it could go through the roof of a building, or it could damage a car. You certainly wouldn't want to get hit by that. And that's sort of the worst case scenario. Is a big chunk of metal falls, and you kind of imagine an anvil falling from the sky. It's you definitely don't want to get hit by it, and it could do some damage where it lands. But it's not going to be like a bomb. It's not going to come down and it's not some kind of a round or something that would come down and explode. So let's see other questions here. Just scrolling through, kind of keeping you updated. And right now, this thing is just over a lot of empty space in the Pacific Ocean. And as you can see, over time, I've been talking about, hey, most of the Earth's surface is ocean. This is exactly what I'm talking about, where this thing is just cruising out over nothing right now. And as you can see from the kind of the right image, the next pass over land will actually be kind of the northern end of South America. So that will really be the next pass. Will it tear apart like what sadly happened to the Space Shuttle Columbia? Just curious. The answer is yes. When these objects re-enter, there are huge aerodynamic forces as well as heating forces that take place. It can be a very violent environment. And so this object, which is now about 100 feet long, 16 feet wide, cylinder, will be ripped into pieces and will separate into many, many different fireballs. And so, yes, it will look quite similar to that, to that whole Columbia re-entry, where you end up having some brighter fireballs near the front where the heavier objects are, and some, the other objects will kind of flake off it and also be burning or have the appearance of being burned as well. Is somebody asking, is it more likely to crash into the Earth over South America? So it's going to be passing over South America. If it were to go into a re-entry here, in the next, several minutes, it could actually land somewhere in South America. But we still think that there's about 2 hours or so until re-entry. So it may not actually re-enter at this time. Somebody once again kind of asking about a tsunami. There is no tsunami risk from this. It is not enough mass, and it likely will break up and slow down enough that there is really no threat of that. So if you live along a coastline, you don't have to be worried about some tsunami warning. It would be much more likely to have an earthquake cause a tsunami in the next few hours than this object. It just doesn't have enough mass. It's not heavy enough, not big enough. How fast will it go back to Earth? So it's currently traveling around 17,000 miles an hour. When it starts to re-enter, it will slow down. And by the time once the fireballs all go out, it'll enter into a period called dark flight, where the speed of the pieces will likely be between 1 and 200 miles an hour. King Quedo, thank you very much for the $5. Could this be intercepted and blown into small pieces to burn up quicker? So the answer is yes, it could be. There are a number of militaries who do have, various, basically anti-space or anti-satellite missiles are called. They're usually on board, certain types of warships. So if one of these warships was basically underneath this ground track, they could fire a missile and they could blow it into smaller pieces. Now, there's good news and bad news with that. The good news is smaller pieces are less likely to cause damage, but the bad news is that some of the pieces, because it's an explosion, would actually be boosted into higher orbits where they could pose a potential threat to the International Space Station, to astronauts flying on the Soyuz or the Crew Dragon or any other space vehicles, other satellites. So the reason we're not actually blowing it up into tons of pieces is we don't want to see, we don't want to see, more space debris. Hayden Love Life, thank you for the $1.99. Appreciate it. Says, puts on Superman cape. Time for daddy to work. Yes. Superman would be great to safely take this thing down into the Pacific Ocean right now. That would be an ideal scenario. So get to work. So how large would be the affected area? So when these objects do re-enter, they break up into many different pieces. You end up having kind of an ellipse that's formed. So the heavier objects will go further along. They have more mass. They'll hold on to their speed longer than the lighter objects. It's hard to say how big this ellipse would be, and most of the area on the ellipse would have nothing land on it, right? It would just be a few pieces scattered throughout this ellipse. So sometimes ellipses can be, a few miles long. Sometimes they can be dozens of miles long. It really just depends on how much separation you have, how much heavier the heavier pieces are than the very light pieces once you have reentry occur and you have the breakup occur. Sometimes they can be 100 miles long. It just really depends. But the actual affected area will really only be where the pieces land. So if one lands on you, right, that's a bad thing. But you just take a step to the left or to the right and there's no effect. So that there's not going to be like pieces hitting and then a fireball kind of erupt from where it hits. It's literally just going to be whatever it lands on, has a piece of metal land on it, but it's not going to, blow up or be a missile or bomb or anything. Amasha Shah Roki, thank you very much for the $5 again. Really appreciate it. So when this thing starts, it has a question. So when this thing stops moving on the radar and footage here, it may have crashed. So it won't instantly show the moment that it happens necessarily. But what would happen is we get constant radar updates, and we'll have a radar update, and then all of a sudden we won't have a radar update, and it'll be gone, right? And that will tell us that, okay, be somewhere between the last radar update and the current radar update, this thing will be presumed to re-enter the atmosphere. And so the best way we may actually be from somebody's social media post, looking up at the sky, seeing a fireball, taking a picture, taking some video, or making a post about it to let us know that, hey, I've seen fireballs along the ground track. That would be a definitive sign. Stacy A, thank you for the $4.99. That's super awesome. Really, really appreciate it. Tourlog, thanks for the $10. Very, very cool. Asks, why are there no self-destruct option? I thought this is easy to detect the fall and the heat while traveling through the atmosphere and self-destruct from a safer altitude if it loses the connection. Yeah, so there is no flight termination system that's still active on this thing. So in rocketry, you have a launch, and even for Starship, which recently launched down here in Boca Chica, Texas. So you'll have the rocket will launch, and it has this little device on it called the flight termination system. And this is basically a bomb that's located alongside the side of the rocket that's a shape charge. And if the rocket veers off course, or if somebody commands, one of the launch operators determines that something about it isn't flying safely, they can send a radio signal to this flight termination system, and it will basically ignite this explosive device on the side of the rocket and basically blow it up intentionally so that it doesn't fly intact and go to some populated area or something. Now, in this case, this is this is the core stage of a Chinese rocket, and the flight termination system either is no longer active on it, or is no longer has electrical power to work anymore because it's actually been in space for many days now. So there is no flight termination system, unfortunately, that can just blow this thing up anymore. And you wouldn't want to activate it until it was in the atmosphere anyway, because if you activated it too high, you could send pieces up to to other orbits, which could be a hazard for astronauts or a hazard for other satellites. Canadian Republican, thank you for the $5. Says, chances it'll land in Canada. P.S. You sound like Ben Shapiro. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. There is some chance that it could still land in North America. However, on the last with the last data we have, it's looking like it may land earlier than the passes that would occur over North America again. So it's not looking too likely it'll land in North America right now, but always subject to change. If it ends up staying in orbit a little longer than expected and makes it till the early morning hours, it could still land in Canada. Fernando de Galleves, thank you very much for the $4.99. Ask a question: how long will it take from the moment it enters the atmosphere till it hits the ground? Best estimate is anywhere from between 5 minutes and 20 minutes. Really just depends on the size of the chunks that that make it. I would guess kind of closer to the 20-minute mark is probably where most of the pieces would end up being. So it's it has to, a lot of things have to happen. It has to slow down from 17,000 miles an hour down to about 100 to 200 miles an hour, and then it's got to fall a long distance. It takes quite a bit of time, to fall through 50 miles of distance. So really just depending on the weight and the ballistic coefficient of each of those objects, and the ballistic coefficient is sort of a measure of the mass of the object in relation to how much drag that object has. So heavier objects, will fly further and will keep their orbital speed longer, make it to the ground sooner than lighter objects, which will also have a smaller terminal velocity. And you think about it, it makes sense. If you drop a feather from 20 miles high, it's going to take a lot longer for the feather to hit the ground than if you drop a bowling ball, right? So it's a sort of a similar type of process. But yeah, toward log, you have a good point about, why can't we just sort of self-destruct it? And the ideal thing, what normally happens in these situations with most spacefaring companies and nations, is they will intentionally fire the engines again once they're in orbit to intentionally drop it into the ocean, usually the southern Pacific Ocean, which is very large, and make sure that the pieces are not a hazard to any humans on the ground. But unfortunately, for whatever reason, that didn't happen in this case. We still don't quite know why. We don't know if they didn't try to do it, or if they tried to do it and had a technical issue. And it still happens. Periodically this happens with different rocket stages. There are actually a lot of rocket stages from even the 60s and 70s that are still in space now. That are often at higher orbits. But this kind of stuff happens. Paganix, Ignis, thank you very much for the donation. Asks, how much is the estimated impact area once it hits the ground? And the answer is, these pieces are not going to still be traveling fast enough to cause like a bomb effect. Really, it's going to be like dropping metal pieces out of an airplane. So depending on the size of those metal pieces, the area that they land on are going to really be the area that's impacted. It's not going to like cause some kind of a shock wave or a blast wave or anything like that. It's just going to be pieces of metal falling, raining out of the sky, and the areas where those pieces of metal hit will be impacted anywhere, you step a few feet one way or the other out of the way of the pieces and you'll be fine.